The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has just said that an Israeli offensive on Rafah would be an unbearable escalation. He was responding to Benjamin Netanyahu's comments that Israel will carry out an operation in Rafah regardless of whether a ceasefire deal is reached with Hamas. The Israeli Prime Minister was speaking at a meeting with the families of hostages where he reiterated that Israel would eliminate Hamas and achieve total victory. Take a listen.
We will enter Rafah because we have no other choice. We will destroy the Hamas battalions there. We will complete all the objectives of the war, including the repatriation of all our abductees.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister there saying Israel would enter Rafah regardless of a deal, and despite its main ally, the US, repeatedly saying it doesn't support an all-out offensive there. Well, Rafah is a city in southern Gaza where more than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering after being ordered to evacuate there on the grounds that it was a safe zone. This is what it's like in Rafah now. Many residential buildings reduced to rubble. Large camps for displaced Palestinians like that one have sprung up around Rafah and thousands of children live there. You can see plumes of smoke from an Israeli airstrike close by. Well, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres urged Israel against invading Rafah.
Recent weeks have seen airstrikes on the Rafah area. A military assault on Rafah would be an unbearable escalation, killing thousands more civilians and forcing hundreds of thousands to flee.
Well, a retired Israeli army colonel told us why she believes Israel's assault on Gaza will go ahead regardless of a ceasefire deal.
The only place that Hamas still has full military capability, like what they did on October 7th, is under Rafah. It's not in Rafah, it's under Rafah, in that subterranean arena. So I do think it would be postponed. I don't think it would ever be cancelled.
So what does Mr. Netanyahu's latest pledge mean for the ceasefire deal currently on the table? Well, Israel says it will wait until Wednesday for a response from Hamas. A reminder, the deal put forward includes a 40-day truce in return for the release of some hostages. It would also allow for displaced families to return to northern Gaza. It's also reported to involve new wording on restoring calm to Gaza, designed to satisfy Hamas's demand for a permanent ceasefire. Well, Nawaf Al-Thani is the former Qatari Director of Defence Intelligence Operations. Remember, Qatar is a crucial player in the talks. Here's his assessment on the likelihood of the deal going through.
Hamas and other factions in Gaza have said that they may not have a clear number of all the hostages where they're located. There is the possibility, in fact, we know that there have been hostages that have been killed through either bombings or internally in Gaza, depending on the story. It's quite unclear. So getting back all the hostages is the unclear bit about this. Now, moving forward, this is structured differently. Now, will the Israelis stick to the plan and not attack Rafah before that? That is the big question, because if that continues to happen, it's very unrealistic to expect that Hamas would agree to a ceasefire.
Well, the top US diplomat, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, has just arrived in Tel Aviv. These are the latest pictures of that arrival. He'll be discussing the ceasefire negotiations. He arrived there from Jordan, and here's what he had to say before boarding that flight.
Our focus right now is on getting a ceasefire and hostages home. That is the most urgent thing. And it's also, I think, what is achievable because the Israelis have put a strong proposal on the table. They've demonstrated that they're willing to compromise. And now it's on Hamas.
Let's cross live now and speak to our security correspondent, Frank Gardner, who is in Jerusalem. And Frank, how hard is Mr. Blinken's job going to be now, given the rhetoric from Mr. Netanyahu today about the inevitability of a Rafah offensive?
Well, he hasn't put a timescale on that offensive. I'm sure that the US State Department won't find that particularly helpful. They've also reiterated their view that they have not yet seen what they say is a credible Israeli plan that would address their humanitarian concerns about the plight of the Palestinians in Rafah. The US does not want to see a US operation in Rafah. Yet the mood music that's coming out of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu today is very robust, all about total victory of pursuing the last remaining Hamas battalions. To some extent, he's throwing a bone to the hardliners in his own cabinet, people who've said that if there is a ceasefire deal that lets Hamas off without a Rafah offensive, they will walk. So, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu's got a lot of juggling to do. He's trying to please all people at the same time, the Americans, the negotiators, and the right-wingers in his own party, as well as the families of the hostages who are not impressed so far by the failure of the Israeli government to get those hostages out. The last time we saw a mass release of hostages was in November. How was it done? Was it done by military pressure? No. It was done by a mediated deal by the Qataris. And the hostage families believe that that's the only, or at least the best way to get their loved ones out. That doesn't seem to be the view of Prime Minister Netanyahu, who seems determined to press on with this operation. It's risky stuff because, you know, if you're going to be fighting to get the hostages out, there's a high chance that those who are left alive could be caught up in the crossfire.
Frank, thank you. We've been talking over the past few days about those protests springing up in campuses across the United States. Well, pro-Palestinian students are demanding their universities divest from Israel over its war in Gaza. Today, we've received these dramatic pictures from the Chapel Hill campus of the University of North Carolina. Many protesters were detained after the university sent them a demand to vacate their encampment. Well, this is the campus at Columbia's university. The unrest there shows no signs of abating. It's here that the protest camps and demonstrations first began before spreading elsewhere. Well, Susan Banowski is the Professor of Writing at Columbia University School of Arts. She's also a Jewish faculty member. I asked her whether she ever felt the protests were unsafe or anti-Semitic.
So I myself, who have been on campus for many of the last days, have not personally experienced anything anti-Semitic. I do not feel in any way unsafe on campus, and I know that a large number of other Jewish faculty members feel that way. I've also heard reports of anti-Semitic incidents, and I know that some Jewish faculty members don't feel safe on campus, but I myself most certainly do. I have seen many words being thrown around that are strongly against Israeli policies and Israel's slaughter of civilians in Gaza over these last months. And certainly there's a great deal of anti-Israeli government speech happening on campus. I have not felt speech that individually targeted me as a member or specifically Jews as Jews.
Well, that was a professor from Columbia. Let's cross live now and speak to the BBC's Nomia Iqbal, who is at Columbia University in New York, and Tom Bateman, who's at the University of Texas in Austin. Nomia, to you, first of all, if I may. We've been reading that there have been threats of expulsion, in fact, of students who are involved in the encampment. What more do we know about these threats?
That's right. The protests escalated, as we saw last night, when some pro-Palestinian demonstrators took over Hamilton Hall. And we saw some scenes of people smashing through windows and what have you. And so that sparked the university to release a new statement. I'm just going to quote you exactly what they said. They said, "We regret that protesters have chosen to escalate the situation through their actions. Our top priority is restoring safety and order on our campus." And so those people that were involved in that, we don't know exactly who they were. The university is saying they face expulsion. On top of that, you've got students who are being suspended now. Yesterday, the university issued this 2 p.m. local deadline for them to clear out the encampment. That didn't happen in terms of the students doing that. They stood strong. They said they wouldn't move. What I can tell you also is that one of the lead negotiators that was talking to the university, sort of like a conduit between students, the protesters, and university leadership, has been suspended. I spoke to him just a moment ago, and he said he doesn't know on what basis he was suspended, because he had an agreement with the university as a negotiator that he could go back and forth. He said he never entered the encampment after 2 p.m. He's a Palestinian student who has come from Syria. He said that he just doesn't know now where his future is. If this hearing does go ahead, he's due to have a hearing at some point along with many other students, he could permanently be kicked out of the US. But he did also say to me that he doesn't think the protests are over, the ends justify the means, and that, to quote him, Mahmoud Khalil, he said to me, it doesn't compare to what people in Gaza are going through right now. So despite what the university is doing, and it's becoming very robust and taking action against students, for many of them, this hasn't quelled what they're doing. It hasn't put their protest to an end. We're still seeing outside the gates here at Columbia University, there are still some protests going on outside, but security has tightened up here.
Okay, Nomia, thanks. Let's cross live now to the University of Texas at Austin and speak to Tom Bateman. And Tom, we heard there Nomia talking about those threats of arrests, of disciplinary action, not putting students off at Columbia. What's the feeling in the University of Texas in Austin?
Well, so far here today, all very calm, all very quiet. We've seen in the last 20 minutes or so a group of, well, we're about 24 or so protesters, but I think even more gathering now, as you can see there. But it was yesterday that the tensions really exploded here when once again, for the second time in a week, the situation was that the state police, the troopers, were called in, armed with batons, with mace, pepper spray, and they came here after the university administration called in those forces. They say that the protesters, who at that point had an encampment here, had refused to heed the university rules, that the encampment should be removed. And so there were some pretty violent scenes as some of the protesters were dragged out by the Texas troopers. And I was just chatting to a couple of protesters here who said that pepper spray was used against them a bit further up as a police van was moving, taking some of those arrested away. One of the protesters telling me that he was maced himself, and two others, he said, quite badly hurt when that pepper spray was used. This had all really escalated significantly last week, because here in Austin, it's one of the places where the protests really gained momentum in solidarity with what was happening in Columbia. When the police earlier this month first went into Columbia to remove the encampments, and as far as the protesters were concerned, in an extremely heavy-handed way, we then saw the protests spread significantly and build momentum in many other parts of the US. One of those was here, and it was really the encampments that the university administration was saying was unacceptable. The university, for its part, saying that it had given repeated warnings to the protesters to move. It says they hadn't, and accuses them of escalating the situation. It talked about, for example, baseball-sized rocks being strategically placed on the lawn here. I was just chatting to one of the protesters. He said that there are stones on the lawn here, and people have been using them, as they always do, to weigh down their papers in the wind. So they're saying that was complete nonsense from the university administration, but clearly more potential here for things to escalate again. We saw some more police just watching on over the protests, and more protesters likely to gather now.
Tom Bateman in Austin and Nomia Iqbal at Columbia University, thank you both for joining us today. Well, let's just take you briefly now to show you these live pictures coming into us from North Carolina, the campus at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You can see a group of protesters gathered around a Palestinian flag being flown on a mast. We know that police on this campus have detained multiple protesters already during demonstrations today. In fact, the university has said that roughly 30 people were detained earlier on this morning, local time, when they clashed with campus police. They were refusing to leave the area. So there we have a bit of more of a flavour of these protests happening in another university campus. That is in the university campus of North Carolina in Chapel Hill.